This is Modern Gaming Culture. This series will attempt to highlight the phenomenon of PC, console, and mobile gaming and bring to light all of its phenomenal aspects. Let's take a dive together into the world of modern gaming and take apart its structure. Now, here's your host, Rotimi Osagi. All right, this is Modern Gaming Culture. This is episode 9, Modern Gaming Culture. And this episode, I think I spent a lot of time preparing for. Particularly, really wanted to make this episode special because this is an episode where um, like we're getting a lot of progress comes to really sorting out a lot of problems, right? Particularly with the hobby shop that we sort of touch base at. And so this is an episode where I really want to, sort of just, take stock, right? This is like, it's kind of like it's snowing where I'm at, right? And so, you know, this is almost like one of those like Snowden specials, like, those kind of like in cartoons or in like sitcoms, like kids sitcoms. They do those episodes, where the kids or the characters rather, where they get trapped inside, right, or something like that, and it's just a whole like dialogue episode, sort of like series of dialogues, right? Uh, you know, that genre is generally referred to, as kind of like colloquially as like mind fuck, right? And so, it's sort of like a psychodramatic, right, play, with a lot of distressful scenarios, etc. Right? And so, um, this episode I think is gonna kind of feel similar to that because I want to kind of lean into people, but I'm also not gonna lean into people, which is sort of like the nature of a mind fuck, right? I'll just use that term, right, to refer to it because that's the term that is used for it, and I don't really want to, sort of um euphemize, the term. And so that's the term I'm just gonna use. So, if you get uncomfortable, it's kind of ironic if you do because of what I'm talking about. So, you know, um, it's something where I feel like it's a very important part of like especially people who are in entertainment, their workflow. It's kind of partaken in that sort of psychodrama, right? And so I kind of want to sort of introduce that as a mainstay scenario, if you will, that will come up on the show, right? Because gaming culture is so intertwined with entertainment, it's not something you can undermine. So I'm gonna try to incorporate, that sentiment um, into the show, and I'll start with this episode. Now, you know, um, I've introduced a lot of mainstay topics, right? And now this is sort of like scenarios, right? Because on the show, right, I'm gonna want to um, you know, find very creative ways, sort of illustrating a lot of dynamics, right? That's really what um, game and culture is about, right? Is really finding creative ways to illustrate dynamics, right? Um, you know, it's an art, right? And so it's something where you can't undermine the importance of creativity, right? And attention to detail, right? You know, in preparing for this show, right? It's something where I had to be very meticulous with um sort of how I would prepare for the show, right? Because, things are really not as what they seem, right? And so it's not something where I want to, sort of do the show very flippantly, right? Again, something I made a big point of in this first few episodes was about the fact that, this show, right, doesn't represent me just, turning on my webcam, right? And then just, kind of saying what I want to say, right? And I did a lot of preparation for this show, right? And so, even just sort of keeping my wits about me, right? Really, finding closure for a lot of things, right, was a big part of preparing for the show. Um, and so, that's sort of what, um, you know, is really, part of gaming culture, right? Is, answering the, um, the proverbial call, right? You something that's a very big part of, you know, doing work in a hobby shop is, PR, right? Um, doing stuff like business calls, right? Where you are sort of interfacing with people who are regular customers, right? Because generally, people who run hobby shops, um, they tend to take it very personal, right? And so they're very personally involved, sort of like a convenience store similarly, right? Um, but there's a lot of people who are very tyrannistic in hobby shop industry, right? And so, you know, you get different flavors of characters when you enter the hobby shop industry because, you'll find people who are very personally involved, right? But you also find people who are, taking it like something like sort of like a craft store, right? Because it seems like when they think about hobby shops, they think about, basically just being, separated from your business, right? And, um, having the business basically run itself, almost like a public utility. And that, very far from the truth when it comes to hobby shops. Hobby shops is something that you have to be very up to date with, right? And is something that you can't separate yourself from. It's not a business where you can, set it up and then basically it runs itself, right? It's not a public utility, right? And that's really an issue we have, right, with this sort of hobby shop mafia that's kind of around us. Is they're kind of trying to set that up as a business model, right? There's absolutely no indication, one, that the people who are supplying these hobby shops, i.e., the distributors who receive product from the companies that make the product, right? want the business to go in that direction. One, right? And there's absolutely no indication that um, there is a sign, right, that you should sort of take a very impersonal role in a hobby shop business, right? So it's really difficult because a lot of these people basically create this sort of monster that that visits us very regularly. All right. I would consider them bumps more than I would consider them a bottom line. Right. So definitely it is important to keep, your wits about yourself around them. Um, but generally what it seems like they're being sort of programmed to do, so to speak, is basically like um sort of like through, you know, like almost like reverse psychology, right? Um this idea of sort of like thinking out loud, right? Um get us to sort of, take that impersonal role because of the inspiration, of, the hobby shop owners that are taking a very impersonal role, right? Um, these guys, they don't operate much on a profit. That's the thing, right? A lot of hobby shops around here, right? They don't really operate on a profit, right? They are, you know, basically trying to set up this, sort of it's actually that what they're trying to set up is basically like, basically a money making machine, if you will, right? It's something where they're basically trying to like retire, basically, right? Like this sort of early retirement culture is kind of leading into gamer culture a lot, right? Get all these sort of scallywags, these sort of hustler culture guys, you know, who, sell people, $1,500 courses basically on how to do like, cold calls, etc. Right? And these guys are like 25 years old, and they have like $20 million in the bank, right? Of money that's basically not going to grow, right? Because essentially what they've done is they've basically created this like veritable Ponzi scheme where basically um, people keep buying in, and the only thing that's keeping the scam up is the fact that people keep giving it money, right? So then once people figure out, if I don't give this thing money, it's not going to survive, then they're not going to give money anymore, right? And then that's reflecting, right, on hobby shops. Because now it's making it look like, oh, trading card games are a bubble, right? And it's not. Now that's so far from the truth, it's unbelievable, right? And so that's really what needs to be understood, right? Um, and it's a problem, right? And essentially, what we have is this problem, right, where basically people who are, very personally involved in hobby shop culture, right, are basically, having money left on the table, basically, right? And so it's an issue where, now they're demanding, basically, with one great voice that's somehow, some sort of like veritable messiah, sort of like all these guys that come in to, sports or, fields and sort of like set a standard, right? To come into gaming culture, right? And there hasn't been any, right? There hasn't been anybody like that, right? You have these guys, who run these teams, right? and they have pretty successful stand-ins in their organizations. Teams like SKT Telecom, T1, now known as T1, right? Um, Coming in, right, and they just won their, I think, their fifth world championship, right? Um, you know, but the thing is they have a formula for winning in their league, but that doesn't bleed in to their game, right? A lot of stuff in solo queue, um, solo queue and pro leagues are completely different, right? Nothing really bleeds in. You used to have a lot of bleed in from ranked to pro leagues, and now you don't have any bleed in at all, right? And so now it's like this one great voice is coming out, and it's like, oh, you have to bring us the great news that it's gonna be okay. I don't know who that helps, right? It doesn't help the trading card game companies, right? Because that's not going to help with their profits. What they have is an issue is these people who are basically um, they're basically warping their markets for their benefit. And then they're not even really benefited because a lot of these people are really running at a loss, right? And it's basically just short-term gains, right? Sort of that like that Ponzi scheme sort of, kind of shown its face again, right? And so I don't understand how someone's going to come in and fix that, right? Because the issue clearly seems to be with the market. It doesn't seem to be with, you know, it doesn't seem to be with the trading card game people, right? It's a very very far left, very, far left socialist leaning into communist worldview is what it is, right? So you can see a lot of politics really, bleeding in to gaming culture, right? When it's not supposed to be. Because the funny thing is that gaming culture really doesn't even have an influence on politics that much, right? And so it's very funny, that kind of irony, right? So I think I'm gonna leave it there for part of this episode. Um, and to conclude, you know, really think about kind of what's going on when you enter a hobby store because it's not an amusement park, right? So this is Morning Gamer Culture. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you.